Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Zakarian. I work here in the Office of Civics and Community Service at the Los Angeles Public Library. Today's program is the first in a series brought to you by USC Center for the Changing Family, and it's a panel discussion featuring three authors discussing the complexities of caregiving. Darby Saxby from USC will moderate a conversation with Kate Washington, author of Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America, and a speaker on the systemic challenges facing family caregivers. Deborah Cohen, professor of sociology and author of Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family, caregiving, and redemption, and Chris Gabbard, professor of English and author of A Life Beyond Reason, a disabled boy and his father's enlightenment. Please send us your questions throughout the program, and we have a short Q&A after the discussion. Take it away, Darby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're really thrilled to be co-sponsoring this panel with the LAPL. I'm Darby Saxby. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California and the co-director of the USC Center for the Changing Family. The Center for the Changing Family is a multidisciplinary hub for family studies research at the University of Southern California. We have 75 affiliated faculty and graduate students representing departments and schools ranging from psychology, sociology, pediatrics, law, social work, preventive medicine, and many others. And we seek to galvanize research, training, and dissemination of our work to the community through events like this one. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and I'll turn it over to them to tell you more about their stories, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions, which you can submit through the streaming platform. Please note that these books are available through LAPL as downloadable ebooks. First, Kate Washington is a California-based writer with a PhD in Victorian literature from Stanford University. She has a background in food writing and was the dining critic for the Sacramento Bee, as well as an editor for the Zagat Guide. Her first book, Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America, came out this past spring from Beacon Press and describes the challenges of caring for a seriously ill husband while also raising two daughters. Next, Chris Gabbard, a former classmate of Kate's, also has a PhD in English literature from Stanford with a focus on thinkers of the British Enlightenment. He is a professor of English at the University of North Florida. His book, A Life Beyond Reason, A Disabled Boy and His Father's Enlightenment, describes his experiences caring for his son August, who was seriously disabled following his birth. This book, which started as an essay published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, was published by Beacon Press in 2020. And finally, Deborah Cohen is a sociologist and professor at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, who received her PhD from Brandeis University. Her book, Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family, caregiving, and redemption, was published in 2020 by Rutgers University and tells the story of caring for her larger-than-life and emotionally and verbally abusive father as he experienced dementia in late life. So, Kate, let's turn it over to you to tell us more about your story.
Thank you so much, Darby, and thank you for having us. Today, we all want to talk about the crisis of family caregiving in the United States. I should start by saying that each of us has a different kind of experience, which our books detail in caregiving. For a child, in Chris's case, a parent in Deborah's case, and in my case, a spouse. My story of caregiving started in 2014 when I was 42 years old and I had a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I was really only thinking of caregiving in the context of caring for my children. I didn't think at all about the in sickness and health problem part of the promises I'd made when I got married several years before. And my younger daughter was starting kindergarten, and I was then, as I am now, a freelance writer. And I thought to myself, yes, I've made it. I am on the road to having more time for myself. And on the very day that she was starting kindergarten, my husband, Brad, came to me in our kitchen, rubbing his hand along his jawline and said, I have these funny lumps growing along my jaw. Do you think I should go to the doctor? I looked him up and down and thought about all the weight he'd lost over the past several months and, some of his falling asleep at strange times after dinner. And I said, yes, you should definitely go to the doctor and get those checked out. And I didn't know it then, but that moment was my first act as a caregiver. And I want to say that I think this is kind of typical of the way a lot of people get into caregiving. They're not thinking about becoming a caregiver. Symptoms sneak up slowly. This is very typical for, people say with elderly parents with memory loss or, noticing that something is a little bit amiss. And you start out in an advisory role, and before you know it, you're pulled in really to the thick of it. That's definitely what happened for me. It took several months to get Brad a diagnosis of a very rare type of T-cell lymphoma, and several more months after that for him to get into treatment. He actually began treatment with a huge shocking event, which is the other way a lot of people come into caregiving, through a crisis. One evening after dinner, and this was in May, so many months after that September noticing of the jawline lumps, he began coughing up blood as we were sitting down to dinner. I grabbed a neighbor to look after our kids. I ran red lights on the way to take him to the hospital. We both thought he was dying. He had an undetected lung tumor that was growing, that had burst, and he went into emergency chemotherapy. From there, his story was a bit of a whirlwind, and my journey as a caregiver was one as well. It became very intense. I was juggling the time between the hospital and at home and raising the kids and the end of the school year and all of the other things as he was hospitalized. He came home very different from how he had gone in, needing IV antibiotics, which to my surprise, I was expected to administer through his PICC line, and in chemotherapy for the entirety of that summer of 2015. Sadly, he relapsed very quickly after that. And at that point, the only option left to him was a bone marrow transplant, which he had in January 2016. And I should say that he had a very challenging course with the bone marrow transplant, but he did survive. He is now disabled and chronically ill from the after effects of his transplant, but he did survive his ordeal. And it truly was an ordeal. He was hospitalized for 4.5 months. He lost his vision, which he has since regained through multiple eye surgeries. He lost the ability to eat. He didn't see our kids for months. He came home after 4.5 months, incredibly debilitated. And a doctor said to me, as he was being discharged, or just before he was being discharged, when he comes home, he can't be left alone even for a moment. He needs 24-hour care, eyes on him all the time. He couldn't walk across the room unattended. At this point, I'd been busy as a caregiver for about a year. I was exhausted. I had been hustling between the hospital and home as well, again, for all the time of his bone marrow transplant. He was coming home immune suppressed, on dozens of medications, again, in need of pretty intensive hands-on medical care, which is something that is a real hallmark of caregiving now, that families are really expected to step up and provide very intensive hands-on medical care. And I looked at that doctor and I said, how can I do that? I can't do that. I have to sleep. I have kids. And he looked back at me and he said, for most of our patients, family steps in and it works out fine. The reason I wrote my book is to explore that gap between my reality as a caregiver and the blithe assurance that it works out fine from a doctor who didn't have to live the life that was happening inside my home after my husband came home. Because everything got more intense, harder, I had less time for myself, less space for myself, and I was spending hours, more than a full-time job a week, on my husband's care. My story is just one, and those are the particulars which I go into in much more detail in my book. But it's just one of 53 million stories of caregiving in America today. My fellow authors here are two more, and I'm guessing that almost all of you in our audience either are caregivers yourself, or if not that, know somebody who is. That number is growing all the time. The oldest of the baby boomers have reached the age of 75, which means they need more care, and the ranks of the generations behind them are simply smaller. There won't be enough caregivers to fill the need as the needs of our elders grow. In my book, I talk a great deal about the structural and systemic issues that make caregiving so difficult in America today. We have very little policy-based support. We have no paid leave. There is a huge economic impact upon caregivers, and that is disproportionately borne by women. Women make up about 2/3 of family caregivers, which I should say is a demographic that is directly represented by our panel, which is made up of 2 women and 1 man. And the labor that women do and all caregivers do is very considerable. The average number of hours a week is about 24 spent by family caregivers now. And the average duration of family caregiving is almost 5 years. It's 4.5 years. The labor of family caregivers is worth $470 billion a year. And that's an older estimate. And it also costs caregivers directly out of pocket, spending money on family, opportunity costs of having to leave jobs or reduce work hours. That's borne, again, disproportionately by women, and especially disproportionately on women of color. The emotional strain of caregiving is also extreme. Caregivers have high rates of depression, feel isolated, are often overlooked, and are really struggling, often very much in silence. In short, this is a secret, a hidden crisis that affects millions of us and will continue to affect millions more of us. That's why we feel it's so important to have conversations like this one, especially as the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of care to us all. The pandemic has shown incredible strains on caregivers, but I think it's also fair to say that it's highlighted opportunities for change and reform, and to change some of those structural issues that I spoke to earlier. That's something that we can speak to much more in our panel discussion later, but I want to reserve plenty of time for my fellow panelists to tell their stories. And so with that little overview, both of my own story and of some of the issues facing caregivers in the US today, I'll turn it over to Chris. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kate. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank the event organizers, especially Darby and Dorian and the University of Southern California Center for the Changing Family and the Los Angeles Public Library for hosting this author panel today. My name is Chris Gabbard, and I wrote a memoir titled A Life Beyond Reason, A Disabled Boy and His Father's Enlightenment, which was recently published by Beacon Press. This book is an account of my time serving as a caregiver for my late son, August. Here's some background information. There are 11.2 million children with significant disabilities and or complex medical needs living in the United States. Put another way, that's about 1 out of every 5 households caring for such children. A 2014 study found that about the average weekly number of hours that a parent is devoted to caring for a child with a significant disability was 33. And that the average monthly out-of-pocket expenses were $348 over what a typically developing child would require. Multiple studies confirm that women or mothers in these households serve as the primary caregiver of children with disabilities. The number of fathers assuming the primary caregiver position is increasing, but very slowly. I'm going to be talking today about one such family caring for a significantly impaired child, my own. I'll be speaking about the caregiver role from a father's perspective, describing what it did for me. Let me say up front that the caregiver role was forced on me, but that said, I reap rewards I didn't anticipate receiving. And so the theme of my talk today is about the idea of normalizing the idea of men as caregivers, because I believe doing so will be good for families and society, but especially for men themselves. So here's to my family story. August was my wife Eileen's and my first child. He was born in March 1999. Prior to the birth, Eileen's pregnancy had proceeded uneventfully with all signs pointing to a healthy delivery. However, the birth itself was a disaster. The delivery team missed important signs. The baby was born unresponsive. He had to be resuscitated in a procedure that took a couple of minutes. And by the time the newborn took his first breath, the damage had been done. Afterward, no one at the hospital, which was the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center, would tell us what went wrong in the delivery room. the medical staff did inform us of our baby's diagnoses, the most serious of which was hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or HIE. HIE results from a lack of blood and oxygen prior to or during the delivery, causing brain injury. Doctors are tight-lipped about medical mistakes, and everything that Eileen and I know today in 2022 was not apparent to us in 1999 or for many years afterward. 16 years after the birth in 2015, an anesthesiologist who had served on many obstetric cases told us that August's birth sounded like a classic example of labor dystocia, or obstructed labor. Following the birth, Eileen and I took our severely brain-damaged baby home and named him August. As I enumerate the list of his official diagnoses, I'm going to sound like a zealous district attorney overcharging a murder suspect, piling on charge after charge, but here goes. It's hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, cerebral palsy, spastic quadriplegia, profound mental retardation, cortical visual impairment, microcephaly, seizure disorder, and osteopenia. During his 14 years on Earth, August was nonverbal, incontinent, spastically paralyzed, and cortically blind. He could not sit in a chair the way a typically developing child would. He needed upper trunk support, and so he had to be secured in his wheelchair with straps holding his shoulders and chest in place. Propped upright, his head lolled, falling forward and backward, and he drooled because the spasticity affecting his mouth prevented him from controlling his saliva. When he was lying on the floor, he was unable to crawl, scoot around, hold himself up, roll over, or even touch his toes. If someone were to put him down in one spot on the floor and leave him there, he would be found in the same location an hour later, give or take a few inches. Moreover, he never developed intellectually. His developmental gap continued to widen. By the time he was going to be an adult, he beat the level of a 1-year-old mentally, if that. He was like a baby who kept growing bigger and bigger without any increase in the skills and abilities. Because of August's significant impairments, Eileen and I undertook 14 years of extreme caregiving. During that time, we nearly went bankrupt due to a lack of social safety net supports. And I'd be happy to discuss during the question and answer period afterward how it is that a family caring for such a child can go bankrupt. August died 14 years after his birth in October of 2013 as a delayed outcome of the way he was delivered. My son's tragic encounter with the healthcare system did not break my belief in American medicine so much as end my blind faith in it. Because of August and my many experiences with him, I began to understand the importance of caregiving, the just demands of the disability rights movement, the politics inherent in both caregiving and disability, and the need for a robust social safety net for all families, but especially for those caring for significantly impaired children. And these are stories I tell in A Life Beyond Reason. However, the most important story I tell concerns my own transformation. When I was a young man, I imagined that loving and wanting love were weaknesses to be overcome by force of will. Only weak-minded people needed love. I attempted to live my life guided solely by reason, and I assumed that material reality or physical reality was the only reality that mattered. I accepted at face value Socrates' proposition that the unexamined life is not worth living, and I adhered to a Peter Singerish utilitarianism. Piloted by this material worldview, I took for granted that the only logical thing that a rational person could do, if burdened with caring for a cognitively impaired dependent, would be to smother him with a pillow. Life, I discovered, was not so simple, for despite the troubled state of his body and mind, August was a jolly little fellow, the most cheerful person you could imagine, a munchkin delightful to be with. And when I realized that terminating his life was not only unacceptable, but repugnant, I ceased trying to live solely according to reason. And this is why I titled my book, A Life Beyond Reason. It's not that reason doesn't matter anymore, but it's not all that matters. At the time of August's birth, I didn't know that the baby would develop into a beguiling little fellow, that he would elicit great love from me and from many other people, or that like a spirit guide or a Yaqui shaman, he would introduce me to a separate reality. And I didn't know that this separate reality was actually the world of my own heart, my ability to give and receive love. In light of this transformation, And despite what extreme caregiving required, I never felt for long that caring for August was pointless. I felt this way because I had begun to see that it's not the unexamined life that's not worth living, but the life without love. And this is what caregiving did for this father. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to pass things along to Deborah.
Thank you. That's so beautiful, hearing from both of you. Thank you to everyone who made this possible, and to our audience for being here. We cannot wait to have conversation with you. I'm going to do something a little bit different than the other two panelists. I'm going to read a bit directly from the memoir to just give you a flavor of that. And but I want to say one thing to kind of frame it, which piggybacks off of what Kate shared in the beginning. She referred to caregiving as this hidden crisis, as something that is kind of a secret, and that we as caregivers uphold the secret in a certain way until we write about it. And that there actually is some shame in carrying this around. The shame, because the shame starts in those moments, like in the doctor's office, where it's like, you're going to have to do this and you can't leave this person alone. And you're thinking, I have to be perfect. I'm going to have to do this really, really well. And I can't let anyone know where I'm dropping balls, even though they feel like they're dropping all over your head, Well, my memoir is built on two sources of secrecy and shame, and two hidden crises in the country, one being caregiving and the other being domestic violence. So my dad is someone who, well, I still love and miss him. He died in 2012. He was adoring, and he was also abusive. He was probably one of the most creative people I'd ever met in my life, next to my mother. And he was also cruel. He had a capacity for both. And my years of doing battering intervention work with abusers just tells me exactly what my story with my dad tells me, which is this multidimensionality really exists with abusers, and then also with survivors. So I want to, I'll expose you to these two hidden crises in these short passages that I'm going to read. And they come, actually, I'm reading them purposefully out of order, from a part that's later on in the book and a part that's very early on. So the book is Welcome to Wherever We Are, and I'm reading from a chapter called The Gold Pen. In the spring of 2009, I wrote this as my father took a nap. I watch you as you sleep, not unlike you probably watched me as I slept as a newborn baby and as a young girl, in wonder, in awe, in calm, and in worry. A parent watches a child sleep with anticipation of the future. An adult child watches a sick parent sleep with only a sense of the past. You are finally still and quiet. You, a man I know as chaotic and very loud. We rest in this calm as you fall in and out of slumber and as I grade papers. I need to study your face, memorize it, as I know I'll need it one day. Yet the you now is not the you I want to remember. In a few days, I'll be back with over 100 students, giving lectures, attending meetings, going to a concert, meeting a friend for lunch, a performance of the vagina monologues. And in my week ahead, I'll worry about being too busy, about running from one activity to the next. Breathless. Yet one day, Daddy, you did that too, right? How would you restructure those days now? What did you hope for? What do you hope for now? With your tongue half out of your mouth, you resemble a little boy with Down syndrome. You look tired, though I can't tell if you're tired of this life. Yesterday, I brought you coffee from Caribou with one of the napkins that made a jab at Starbucks that said, quote, "Our coffee is smooth and fresh because burnt and bitter were already taken. Whenever I see great lines and logos, I think of you. Your creativity still shines through as we leaf through Metropolitan Home and marvel at minimalist spaces. Your stained maroon sweatpants are pulled up halfway toward your chest, and your stomach looks distended. Earlier today, I saw as you put imaginary pills to your mouth with your fingers, something I assumed to be a self-soothing ritual that you performed after the nurse told you it was not yet time for more medication. Being in Cleveland, I'm surrounded by childhood friends, hanging out with their fathers, younger men than you, in their 60s, their early 70s, robust, athletic, energetic men, vigorously playing tennis and golf, working, traveling, chasing after their dreams, not figments of their imaginations in thin air. Oh, Daddy. Your eyes open suddenly and you ask, what are you writing? I quickly respond, oh, nothing. It's just for school. However, writing about my dad in front of my dad seemed like a profound act of betrayal, and it also felt mean. As I see it now, it helped me grieve and let go. Contained in a tight, unattractive physical space with my father, enmeshed in his care in ways I probably should have never been, I was writing to untangle a knotty family narrative, to finally record and understand my experience as my own. By writing in front of him, I think something else happened that was necessary. I came to realize that all we had to give to each other was space, psychic space. Most importantly, I needed to give him space and quiet to eventually die. My dad's almost 8 years of debilitating illness made me grasp his final inability to help and to guide me. And that gave me the space I needed to dream of what I wanted to do. Though he helped me and was involved in most major decisions I had made in my life, dementia forced him to check out. It also forced me to check back in with how well I was writing my own life. Now, as a little girl, I loved writing. And I guess I was writing my life early on. So I want to just, before we open it up to Q&A, I wanted to share with you a short portion from the beginning of the book where I found diaries that I had written. I had forgotten that I kept them, frankly, because I hadn't done it since, the early 80s. So I'm going to share with you a few entries. These are direct, entries, just as that other passage was directly written by my dad's bedside and basically transposed from the legal pad into this book. It turns out these diary entries are also, but then I do these reflections in it. So I'll share this with you so that you can get a bit of a sense of the complexity and the context. April 16th, 1979. Oh, I should say I was born in 69 and I just turned, I can't believe it, 52. So you can see that I was just 9 years old here. April 16th, 1979. I went out for another coffee ice cream soda. The glass was dirty with cherry gook all over it. Gross. Big messes, small messes. They've always made me nervous. May 6th, 1979. I had a Z day on a rating scale of A to F. Everyone was so mad. Mom and Dad were mean to each other. My dad should be the one that should be blamed. Tomorrow there'll be 2 math tests. I've been scared all day. May 19th, 1979. Sometimes I feel my parents don't really understand me. How come I sometimes have so many fears, but I'm a happy child? Maybe I'm sensitive. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. My dad left for a business trip in Palm Springs, California. I hope I'm the champ in spelling, but I hate studying for tests because it makes me nervous. May 20th, 1979. I went swimming. I did a somersault in the deep end. I miss my dad. I had an A+ day. I love swimming. May 23rd, 1979. Only 2 more days till Dad comes home. I had a B day, but I got a card from Dad. May 24th, 1979. The boy I like talked to me. He's so cute. Dad is coming home tomorrow. and I'm going to have a birthday party tomorrow. I'm going to a birthday party tomorrow. May 25th, 1979. I went to the party. Dad came home. He got me lots of presents like swim fins, a visor, and a bag, and a circus book with a poster and a big history book. May 27th, 1979. My dad poked a knife near my face, but I said I'd forgive him. I had a B day. I was trained early on to ride the cyclical waves of violence. I was swept up in the promise of seeing my father return home, lured in by the excitement of his gifts and his love, yet within 2 days of him being back, feeling again trapped by his rage. The tyranny of perfectionism that I felt inside and outside my home was strangling. And I learned to ask, if only to myself, if I had done something or had forgotten to do something that provoked him. He was always fast to apologize, and in turn, I learned to forgive quickly. I wonder how I could still rate the day a B when my dad did what he did. Skipping a little. April 3rd, 1980, I ran away for 5 minutes. I even packed. Dad kept saying, if you do this, I'm locking your bicycle. April 17th, 1980. Today I got home 15 minutes late. Mom called me a little shit. I was so upset. Dad was angry because I didn't put away my shoes. So Dad was having a temper tantrum and looked like he was going to hit me. I was crying, and then Dad had a talk with me. My father never hit me, but the perception that he could was always there. The threat was present, which actually felt scarier because it was always hanging over my head. Even at age 10, he looked to me like a child having a temper tantrum, a child who could hurt and bully me and make me feel badly. I wonder what my dad and I talked about that day. I imagine he explained the situation back to me using abuser's logic. If I had not been late and had put away my shoes, he never would have been angry. So ultimately, it really was my fault. But that maybe he overreacted and wanted my forgiveness. I wanted to be perfect in his eyes, wanted his approval, his love, and his kisses, and his telling me everything would be okay. So I'm sure I forgave him. At least at that moment, I probably did. But years of doing that too often culminated in years of me later realizing I really didn't need to forgive him or to forget. The last time I ever wrote in a diary was April 17th, 1980. I think I've spent the past 39 years trying to live and write truthfully out of that mess, living in some space between forgiveness and blame, between forgetting and memory. Sometimes, still to this day, as I'm driving alone, I imagine that seated beside me in the car is that precocious little girl who penned all those entries with piles of ringlets on her head, huge, curious, greenish-gray eyes, her feet not yet touching the floor. And I try to remember to ask her what she needs now. If I'm quiet enough and open enough, I might just hear her whisper. So I will turn it over to Darby to facilitate the discussion. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much to the three of you for being here. Your books were all so wonderful. We're really honored that you're doing this event with us. So I kind of want to start with the here and now. I think there are a lot of jumping off points from your books, but one thing that really struck me is that your experiences of caregiving all mostly predated the pandemic, but your books all came out in 2020 and 2021. You probably weren't expecting to be in such good company. So obviously your stories are uniquely complex and challenging, but with remote schooling, daycare closures, nursing home closures, sickness, quarantine, hospital system overload, so many of us are feeling like we're already toast these days. So I'm wondering sort of how your three experiences can kind of help us make sense of this sort of collective moment we're in of caregiving burnout and what we can learn about how to move forward. Let's start with Chris.
Well, I was thinking that if my son were still alive and I were caring for him and the pandemic had hit, I don't know what I would have done because, as you know, I'm a professor and I had to go online and prepare 3 courses, and teaching online is more labor intensive than teaching well, I guess you get some time that you don't have to commute to campus and you save that amount in the car. But outside of that, generally it's more work. And August, he would not have gone to a school. He went to an exceptional student center. And that's what pretty much allowed me to be able to continue working. So I don't know how I would have done that because, I just can't leave him alone. And yeah, I don't know what we would have done, except it would have been I would have had to basically take a leave from teaching, which would have torpedoed our income. There's no amount of government compensation that would have made up for the amount we would have lost. So, and then there's also this balancing and all that stuff. I don't even want to try to think about what that would have been like. But I'd also just to say there's a heck of a lot of families who are in that position right now, who have significantly impaired children, and there's no one to count on for caregiving because they were not coming into homes when everybody was in lockdown. So I know personally that there were a number of really difficult cases for people having to cope every day.
Yeah, Kate and Deborah, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this was on my mind a great deal because I was actually finishing my book as the pandemic was starting. So I was in revisions in March of 2020, and I distinctly remember actually asking myself, like, should I put in some references to this coronavirus thing, or is it going to be a flash in the pan after we do this like 2-week lockdown to flatten the curve? I'm very glad I put in the references, obviously. But I think for me, one thing the pandemic in general has really highlighted is the structural nature of the challenges of caregiving and how much work we have to do to really shore up our care infrastructure, our care economies. Chris spoke to this in his discussion of what he would have done during the pandemic had August still been alive. So many people lost out on their respite care because of paid caregivers leaving the workforce. And I know this is a panel that we focused on unpaid family caregiving, but paid caregiving and the precarity and poor pay of those jobs and often the exploitive nature of those jobs is the flip side of that coin. And we cannot have good, solid family caregiving that supports family caregivers without solid, well-paid, good jobs and with good training for paid caregivers. Like they are essential complements to each other. In my own personal life, my husband had been more independent prior to the pandemic. He still is disabled and chronically ill, but he remains immune suppressed. And so when the pandemic hit, it really thrust me back into a kind of caregiving and being the interface with the outside world that I had not really been experiencing for a year or two or a couple years prior to that. So it really revived old patterns. I also still had kids at home who were on online school. So I felt the burnout and the challenge of that. And I see it in my friends and colleagues and contacts everywhere. I think that, the answers have to be not self-care, but community care and societal level care for our caregiving populations.
Deborah, did you want to add on to that?
Sure, I'll add a couple of things. Yeah, like Chris, I mean, I almost find it unimaginable, but from another level of unimaginable. So when my dad was basically about to die, I was actually in the process of moving across the country from Boston to South Carolina to take on a new job. And I had also just gotten divorced, and I had been living with my ex-husband in the same home for 2 years after our divorce. So if a pandemic happened then, I guess we'd still be living together and I wouldn't be with my current partner, Mike, who I adore. And it would be very hard because it would have been, I already felt very trapped on lots of levels, like trapped with the caregiving stuff, trapped with, trying to get out of a marriage and, making a big life change. I was 42. like when they say all the different changes and, psychological impact, it's like I had them all in the same summer. And so like 3 days before I was starting my job here for the, my brand new job, my dad died 3 days before. So the other complication for me would have been that he was long distance. So he was in Cleveland, and then I'd have the issue of airplanes and travel and all these other things on top of it. But what I can also say is I did lose a parent in the pandemic. So my mother just died a year ago, and that was complicated, but it wasn't because of the pandemic. And I think I saw with her, and I think it definitely would have been more true with my father because she didn't have dementia. The pandemic was very confusing to her, even though she didn't have dementia. Like it was just all sort of beyond the beyond for her. And I think trying to deal with a pandemic and a father in a nursing home and dealing with the nursing home in this, I mean, yeah, it would be very, very hard. It's one of those things, I guess if I was in it, I would have done it just in the same way that like my friends would say to me during this whole time, I can't believe what you're doing. I can't believe all that you're doing. And I know the three of us were told this by different people, but it's also because it's, there's kind of no way to prepare for it. There's just that sense of, you just have to do it. And in some ways, like Chris said, the whole thing becomes an act of love. And there's definitely moments where there's resentment and stuff. And there's also the sense that Kate's alluded to before that, like that people get it in a certain way. They understand, they're compassionate, but they don't really understand. Like they're understanding, but they don't understand. There's sort of two different pieces to that. So I think that would even be more the case. But I think I just want to emphasize the entrapment part of it, and also trying to get out of controlling marriage at the same time, like just doing everything I was trying to do. Oh my gosh, just it's like, don't make me think about it, but my heart goes out to people who are going through it. So because it's like anything that's complicated got more complicated in a pandemic,
right?
Divorce, caregiving, everything. Domestic violence victims, everybody who is trapped got more individually and then systemically trapped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think thinking of systems, one thing that also really comes through in all three of your books is this unique kind of burnout that comes not just from the caring labor itself, but from interacting with these kind of confusing and hostile systems, whether it's hospitals, doctors, insurance, paperwork, that sort of becomes a full-time caregiving job in and of itself, just making calls and dealing with claims. And it made me curious sort of how much of your care journeys felt unique to this healthcare system, this country. What might this have looked like in another place? And maybe that's also a way to start thinking about, how could things look better? And please, all of you are welcome to jump in and answer that in turn.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I'll just interject here that I live in Florida, and apart from the pandemic, we live in a state we have 52,000 children in the state who are probably pretty significantly impaired. They're on a wait list for the Medicaid waiver, and Medicaid waiver is absolutely essential in order to get any kind of essential services like therapies and copays for doctor's visits and also respite care. And there's, of that 52,000, only 22,000 are on the waiver itself. The other 30,000 plus are waiting, and sometimes that waiting list is over 10 years long. Kids die on the waiting list. Some people have been on the waiting list for 15 years. And it's daily. It basically comes down to the political structure of the state, which doesn't believe in funding. And actually, the Florida legislature, as we're speaking, is talking about cutting funding even further for this population of people. So the state, Florida is not the only one. It's one of the more egregious examples, but there's a lot of other states. Texas is another one where there's just basically woeful coverage. So a pandemic or no pandemic, Florida is probably one of the worst places in the world in the United States to go to for this sort of thing. we were in California, and when my son was born, he immediately got the Medicaid, what's called a Medi-Cal waiver in California. And then I assumed that there was some sort of national, it is a federal mandate to individual states. And when we moved to Florida, so I could take a teaching job here, I sort of assumed that that would travel with us. And then I got here and I realized, oh no, he's on a waiting list. It's only because my wife was so tenacious in calling political people and harassing our representatives that after about 4.5 years, she finally got one of them to listen to us, and he pulled some strings behind the scenes and got us onto the Medicaid waiver. But my son's case was extreme, as he was paralytic, blind, cognitively impaired, nonverbal, everything. But there's other kids in a similar situation, and they just didn't know how. Parents don't know how to pull the strings. They don't know how to manipulate the system. They don't know who to call. Fortunately, Facebook is a great place because a lot of groups now that kind of help. And I monitor one of those Florida groups, and you can see a lot of people come on there asking for advice, and they're not terribly well educated, but there's people there who can help them, kind of guide them. But they're fellow parents. They're not like agency people. So I won't hog the floor here anymore, but I just want to say that talking about place, yes, it kind of depends also where you are geographically.
Yeah, it's so striking to hear just the state by state differences in your experience of giving care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll say briefly, I was recently actually talking with some people in Europe about giving a talk about caregiving. And it was very interesting, the differences that came up, as I was talking about some of the challenges that caregivers in the US face. And they're like, oh, really? That we don't have that here. So, I do think that a robust social safety net makes a world of difference. And in the conclusion to my book, I actually look at some specific examples, both different state programs. Washington State, California have some policy advances that are really promising and exciting, but also examples from Europe, from Japan, which of course is known for having a rapidly aging population and kind of looking ahead to caregiving changes. I would say, just for starters, in terms of policy change, the very lowest hanging fruit and the thing that is out there and that we really ought to be able to pass right now is national federal paid leave. It is a crying shame that we do not have that. But of course, dealing with a Byzantine healthcare system, with for-profit insurance, with all of those things, paperwork is not something that I think has traditionally been thought of as part of caregiving, but it very much is a huge part of the American experience. And in a lot of ways, I think that's not unique to America, but distinctive, and a distinctive burden of time on US caregivers is navigating those very, very unfriendly systems that I think Chris alluded to. I mean, there is a reason that my book is called Caregiving. The subtitle is Caregiving and Burnout in America. It's specific to, we make it harder here. It doesn't, caregiving for someone you love will always be emotionally hard, but it doesn't have to be this hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to kind of jump off from that, and maybe Deborah, you can start on this one, but we also have this unique, very sort of intersectional and gender dynamics around caregiving. And that comes through in the 3 books as well, right? Like care work being delegated to women of color traditionally, and that contributing to undervaluing of care labor through racism and sexism. Kate, in your book, you talk about your career having taken a backseat to your husband's even before his illness. And so the sort of equitable domestic workload was aspirational kind of even before you took on the extra caregiving labor. And Chris, your story is unique because you in some ways became the primary caregiver because you were the only one who could physically lift August when your wife had the neck and back injuries. So, you really had to step into that role, as a man. So I'm curious how you each navigated some of these sort of gender and culture dynamics, both within your own families and also with some of the paid caregivers and institutions that you interacted with.
Well, I have to say, I'll just pitch in here, is that I was dragged kicking and screaming into the caregiver role. My son was born in 1999, and my wife had a herniated disc from lifting our son in 2009. So for 10 years, it was probably about a 60-40 divide where she did 60% and I did 40%. But then after she was injured basically lifting August and couldn't lift him anymore, I was the person who had to do basically everything because I was the only one who could get him to appointments and put him in his wheelchair, lift him up, put him down, all that kind of thing. So that became about a 95%, although she did almost all the, being on the phone to insurance companies, and it can take up a heck of a lot of time, spending time on listening to music while you're on hold, trying to get a representative, getting turned down, getting pushed around, and, your calls routed to somebody else. That takes a lot of time too. So I have to say, though, I did come in kicking and screaming because my cultural expectation was that this is not work that a man is supposed to do.
Yeah, I'll jump in with a couple of things. From the previous question, I just want to say one piece, which is that when I was starting to go through this whole journey, it was my dad fell at Cleveland Hopkins Airport on Christmas Day of 2004, and he died in 2012. And I incurred so much debt from the caregiving and the thousands of dollars spent going back and forth and hiring people and lawyers and the time, like all of what people are talking about. And so I often thought, gosh, here it is. I'm in, I had student loans, but I really need like a caregiving loan more than anything, a caregiving grant, like something that I really, even a loan was going to be hard, but I would have taken that at that point, because then I was just incurring credit card debt and the whole thing got very hard to dig out of. And so when Chris alluded to just feeling the financial constraints so deeply, I mean, mine was just a fraction of that because it was, it was totally different type of caregiving. But I think the point is that, I was in graduate school, I was working multiple jobs, I was commuting between Massachusetts and Connecticut to teach at universities in both states, working with abusive men, traveling back and forth from Boston to Cleveland. I mean, it's the whole thing just, I look back on that and I think, whoa, no wonder my 30s were a blur. But, care loans might have helped, or some sort of care gift. I felt very on my own with that. With gender, I was going to just comment on a couple of things. One is that I found that having a male parent in a nursing home was much, much harder than having a female parent in a nursing home. And that was actually really interesting to me in a different kind of a gendered standpoint, just because nursing homes are really geared to women. They're actually geared to taking care of docile, sweet little old ladies. They're not really geared to dealing with men, and men who've had it their way their whole life and who are big executives and who all that kind of stuff. And the activities at these places are also not geared really to men. They are, nail polish is like one activity, moving on to like knitting, then baking cookies. I mean, it was just a completely non-stimulating environment for my father and for the few other men who were there. And it was very, very clear to me that it was, and he went to a bunch of different nursing homes because he got kicked out on bad behavior. They were not used to dealing with men. That was a huge piece. And then, the gendered aspect of caregiving always interested me intellectually as a sociologist and a scholar of gender, but certainly when you're in it, it's it kind of transcends interesting and becomes, maddening. But the one thing I want to say, and we've done talks before as a group of three, and one thing that Kate has said before, and I really, really resonate with this, which is she's talked about the anger that could come up as a caregiver. And I do want to mention that here today, because, as much as I was, doing this out of profound care and concern and worry and love and everything else, I would be absolutely lying and sugarcoating this if I didn't say that there were times where it wasn't that I was so angry at my dad, actually, at that point. It was just, I was so angry at a system that had so failed all of us, and as a woman caregiving, I was also feeling like I wasn't supposed to show that I was angry because, women's rage is not really validated in the public sphere. Women are only really still kind of permitted to be angry when it's only on behalf of someone else, and usually their children. So it's a real different thing to deal with that. So there's a lot of, in my story, I just feel like there's lots of different pieces of gender going on that I just wanted to throw out there.
And that really resonates with this idea of how do we value care, right? Like Kate's book makes the point that family caregiving is seen as both priceless and worthless. So we have these sentimentalized narratives of caregiving clashing with this lack of structural and financial support. So how would you say your own caregiving journeys were shaped by these kind of confusing messages about how care matters and what kind of value we assign it?
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in to say, one thing that always really struck me was the blithe nature of, the anecdote I mentioned in my chat of, the doctor saying he just needs 24-hour care, as if my 24 hours a day was an utterly disposable resource, and that happens a lot, I think, when you're making appointments or something like that. There's no question of like, is 3:00 okay? Because you'll probably have to pick up your kids from school. You really have to push back. I always felt like the burden would be on me, the onus would be on me as caregiver to push back on any of those assumptions. And I think those assumptions were deeply gendered as well. So I often felt that rage that Deborah alluded to come up. I know we're getting quite short on time, so I don't want to elaborate further and leave space for others. But I think it's a really thorny and difficult question, and that caregiving is often just seen as an endless resource to tap with very little recognition of the cost that has for the individual caring person.
I'll just say ever so briefly that I did have a lot of rage, but it was entirely directed at the state of Florida and the doctors. And I didn't have any of that with my son because I felt like this happened to him. It wasn't his fault. So
I know we've got 2 minutes left. This time really flew by. One theme that really came through in all your books was just the transformative nature of caring, both in terms of the scars that it left behind, but also there's a lot of hope and redemption and love in each of your books. And maybe that would be a good place to end on, is kind of what can we learn from your journeys as we reflect on the value of care and how it changes us to give care?
I'll just interject very quickly that you have to learn patience, which is something I was in short supply of before I underwent this. And I don't know, maybe I've receded back to my normal position since then. But while I was being a caregiver, I did have to learn how to be patient. And that was a valuable thing to learn.
For me, the key take-home message, which I think I've spoken to earlier, is just how important the structural nature is and how much we need community support for each other, how much like we all just need to come together as a culture for change and advocacy around this, though it's really hard when you're in the thick of it with caring, but also support in community networks, asking for the help you need, offering help to the people you know who are going through it. All of these are ways of making care more visible. And care is what makes us human. It's critical to all of us. And we need to really build those connections and build that visibility for change.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add here that for me personally, the act of the caregiving and the years that went on, and then the act of writing about it, is what has helped me heal from abuse, actually. And that I feel in an entirely different place about it. I love what Kate just said about, care is what makes us human. And I think that's a really good thing to remember. And it totally relates to what Chris is saying around making this an available place for men to engage, because it's just a human endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that feels like a wonderful place to wrap up. And the idea of hearing stories of caregivers and listening to the lived experiences of caregivers. This is why we're so grateful to have the three of you here today. So thank you so much for joining us for this event, and thank you to LAPL for co-sponsoring it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, great presentation, guys. Thank you so much for everything. And please join us again next month for Tuesday, March 8th for another moderated discussion with Kate Mangino, author of Equal Partners, an interactive guide to support building household balance in all partnerships. And as you can see, that's our website for more information on this series, lapl.org/maternal family health. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thank you.
Bye.